Welcome to the first part of Module 1. In this section, we're going to cover managing client care. As much as possible, I have tried to follow your ATI manual. The ATI's approach and organization to the leadership topic throughout this course follows a template that does not align well with your textbook. It really follows the concepts that are in the NCLEX review plan, so you feel like as you're going through the topics, you're getting snippets of odds and end topics instead of a real focus in certain areas. So to give you some continuity, I'm trying to follow the ATI book, but as you're going through your reading for the modules in this course, you may feel like you're hunting and pecking all through the textbook, and that's simply a result of the ATI book kind of driving the material in this course. And the reason we do that is because ATI does have a proctored test for you to take, and we want you to be successful and feel like you have the nuts and bolts that ATI and then NCLEX want you to have for your academic success. As I go through these modules, I may add some things that may not show up on the NCLEX and may not be overly important to your ATI developers, but they're probably pretty important to your professional practice. And I want to make sure that you get a little bit of things that will develop you personally, not just things that will help you pass the NCLEX. So bear with me as we wander through the ATI topics. I love John Maxwell's comment here in his quote. He says, "A leader is the one who knows the way, goes the way, and then shows the way." I think that's such a great reminder to those of us that are in leadership positions that we have to first understand the role that we're in, then we have to role model it by going the way, and then we have to show from a day-to-day practice, mentoring, precepting, coaching our team and how we evolve and develop into being strong leaders. As a reminder, many people will take this course and they'll say, well, I have no desire at all to be in a leadership position. Well, that may be true. I want to encourage you to be thinking about nursing leadership as not a C-suite position or an executive position or even a manager or a director. All nurses, if they're practicing their profession well, are leading someone. First, they're leading themselves, then they're leading a team to the people they delegate. They may be leading the care within a patient experience. And then sometimes we step into formal leadership roles. So we're going to talk about the difference between leaders and managers as we move through this module. But I do want you to be receptive to the idea that whether you're going to be on an organizational chart as a leader or not, you'll still be in a leadership position. So much of this topic is still pretty important. My hope is that this slide is a reminder about the difference between decision-making, problem-solving, and critical thinking. I want you to think through these topics and think about the kind of thinker that you were when you began your fundamentals course. As you've moved through your material in nursing school, have you begun to approach your problem-solving differently? Our hope is that you have. We want you to be a critical thinker. We want you to have insight and intuition. We want you to use empathy. We also want you to have a willingness to take action. And those are the characteristics of a critical thinker. When we think about why critical thinking is important, what we know as nurses is that information comes at us at lightning speed. And the minute we understand information, it can quickly become obsolete. So we have to be able to move or be pretty nimble on our feet. The complexity of our profession is huge. We have to be able to think through lots of pieces and parts to make a final decision. There's a limited number of hours of theory and clinical education. What that means is I can only teach you so much theory and have you in so many clinical scenarios. You're going to encounter things in real practice that weren't touched on as you went through your academic program. You can feel overwhelmed. There's just so much information, so much data out there that you begin to feel overwhelmed if you can't parse or sort through the stuff that's important and not important. And then the final reason that critical thinking is important is sometimes what we have to do, we have conflicting responsibilities. So if we are leading an organization, but we're also coordinating care and we're also advocating for our team, sometimes the decision that you have to make doesn't make everybody happy. So being able to critically think through data that's coming at you, that's moving really quickly, that's overwhelming. You have to be able to pull out the important pieces and use those important pieces to make decisions. So that's the progression we'd like to see your critical thinking in. The next step in this is clinical reasoning. So before you graduate, in your early stages of professional practice, this is something that we, as your educators really want to see you evolve in. So clinical reasoning is the integrating and applying different types of knowledge to weigh evidence, to critically think about arguments, and to reflect on the process used to arrive at a decision. This has a sense of thinking about your thinking and really having you slow down and think about as much information as you can and critically appraise it, which basically means you look at the pros and the cons. You think about the rationale behind things, and then you think about how you'll go about making your decision. You're going to do this in a collaborative way, and often if you're using those steps, if you're really slowly thinking through things, you're going to come up with a sound decision, or at least that's our goal. So as you begin to fine-tune the way you use your clinical reasoning, I want to talk about what that looks like when we look at the role of nursing leadership, and then how that differs from nursing management. So this slide gives you kind of an overview of what we look at as leadership versus management. Leaders empower others, they maximize efficiencies, they are needed to implement any change that's part of an organization. So they're the influencers. When we look at managers guide, direct, and motivate others. They intervene when goals are threatened, and then they emphasize control. So when I think about leadership as the person we are. It's the interpersonal skills. It's the ability to create a vision and encourage and share and support. When I think about management, I think about the logistics, the things we do. And there are times that the leader and the manager are the same person, and sometimes they're not. We're going to talk about how these roles of being leader versus a manager can break out into different behaviors and what that looks like, and how we what our current vision of what it means to be a nursing leader looks like. So if we think about leaders and managers, this is a list of what a leader does and what a manager does. And that encompasses what I just said about having the differences in being a leader. I want to remind you that leaders don't often have delegated authority, and that means that they're not on an organizational chart. So if you went into your new job and you said, show me who the bosses are, and they showed you a pretty piece of paper with straight lines and dotted lines, and they talked about how everybody reported to who. Sometimes the most powerful leaders in an organization are not on that chart. Sometimes their position is not formal. They are very much focused on interpersonal stuff, on group process, on how we get things done, not the fact that we got them done. Whereas managers focus on logistics. Very often managers are solidly on your organizational chart. You know exactly who they are. You know what their job is. They come with a very clear definition of their job description. It's important for you to know the difference of a leader and a manager. Let's look at the skills. So when we think about a good leader, you're talking about someone who is a visionary, who motivates people, who leads others, who helps influence, who inspires, who's brave, takes risks, empowers. The other important skill of a good leader is that they can master change and that they can facilitate it. Good managers, again, we're back to the logistics. It's coordinating resources, optimizing how those resources are used, meeting goals, following rules, planning, organizing, directing. They're the person that you look and you say, who's the person that's going to get something done? And then you think about the leader who's going to help the people move so they're willing to get something done. I think it's interesting to when I look at this and I think of the list of good leaders and good managers, and I have worked for both. I have had great leaders and I have had great managers. Interestingly enough, I have had very few integrated leaders and managers that I have worked for. I've had people that could put things on Word documents and could Excel spread them till the cows came home, and they were so good at the logistics of everything. But their ability to inspire others or mentor or precept was very limited because they didn't have as much emotional intelligence or interpersonal skills. Whereas I have worked for fantastic leaders who were great visionaries, big picture thinkers, inspiring to listen to, but they could not manage the logistics of just running an effective meeting. So there's pros and cons, and you really have to kind of think about where your strengths are, and do you want to develop the other side of being an effective nurse leader. This slide covers the 10 fatal flaws of leadership, and I'm not going to read these to you, but I do want you to read through them and think about them. They're pretty important, and they are so easy to step into, especially for new leaders who feel a little overwhelmed in their position. Let's talk about the management process. This is back down to, if we're just going to get into the logistics of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. When we think about planning means that we're going to come up with how we're going to manage our projects, how we're going to manage fiscal resources, how we're going to go through the logistics of making changes. This is the planning piece of it, and it's an important first step when you deal with management. The next step in the management functions is organizing, and this is when you think through organizational processes, which include establishing the structure to carry out a plan, determining the most appropriate type of patient care deliveries, what kind of group activities are needed to meet goals. Other functions include working within a structure and understanding how to use power and authority appropriately. So this really does focus on processes. The next step is staffing, and this is the people stuff. This is hiring and recruiting and interviewing, what we look at for scheduling and staff development. Employee socialization is important under staffing. Team building also lands under staffing, because as individual team members, it's important that we play well together. Our next step is directing. Directing is dealing with people's problems. So once you hire them in step 3, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to invest in them? Are you going to find ways to motivate them? How are you going to manage the conflict that is surrounding us in the work world? How are you going to manage delegating and communicating, or even facilitating collaboration? How do you get everybody to work together once you hired everybody? So directing is managing the staff. And our last step is controlling. And this area of the management function really focuses on working towards outcomes. We want to have a process in place to make sure that what I say I'm doing as a nurse, I'm actually doing. So this function includes performance appraisals, fiscal accountability. At the end of the year, is your budget balanced? Quality control, legal and ethical control, and professional and interpersonal boundaries and control. The last step is so important, that as we go through our process, as we implement things, as we hire people, as we create teams, at the end of the day, if we don't actually do what we say we're doing, which in my mind as a nurse is to provide safe and effective patient care, if we're not doing that, then we really need to go back over and review our plan and come up with a new one. So the controlling piece of it is a key evaluation step for us, and it's so important. But these are management steps. These really are just the nuts and bolts. Leaders are very often outside this process, and the leader needs to walk alongside this process with whoever is doing it and make sure that it's being done effectively. Historically, we've had an evolution of leadership theory. I love the picture of these fish, and it took me a long time to realize why I really liked it. If you look at the first goldfish, you can barely see the tail of the goldfish. And the fins, they are flapping so fast. You think about a hummingbird. That one is blazing the trail. He is moving so quickly, or she, could be a girl goldfish, moving so quickly that everyone is having to swim to keep up with them. And that really, when we think about the leader, is how we blaze trails. In the early part of leadership theory, the idea was that you were born to be a leader. It was just who you were. It was ingrained in your personality. We moved next into behavioral theories, that leaders needed to adjust their approach to the situation that they were dealing with. So if you wanted something done, you used this method. This is the era of leadership theory that came up with the authoritarian or democratic or laissez-faire leadership styles. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But it was very much, if this is the person, then this is the style I need. Later we came into the behavior of the person driving how the leader dealt with it, versus the situational leadership, which came in the 50s and then evolved more finely into the last probably 10, 15 years. The contingency theory was that other factors in the environment influence the outcome, that it wasn't just the person and the manager, that there were other pieces and parts involved. I don't need you to memorize the evolution of this. What I want you to understand is that the early thinking that people were either a leader or not a leader, that they had traits or they didn't, there's some truth to that. But we've also learned that with the right heart and the right intent and the right training, anybody can be a leader. And we know that we can't just craft a script of if this happens, then this happens, and this is what the manager does every time. What we know in 2019 is that anybody can be a leader. All sorts of behaviors influence the outcome in the professional world, and that a good leader has a massive toolbox with lots and lots of approaches and styles that are used appropriately within the situation and the environment that the situation is occurring. We've got to be super flexible. Not every situation is the same, and not every employee is. So when we think about the common leadership styles or behavior theories, the autocratic theory is really the leader directs. They come on the floor, they come in the unit, and they say, this is what we're doing. The democratic or the participative leader is sharing the responsibility, pulling everybody together at the nursing station and saying, all right, guys, what do we want to do today? How do you want to approach patient care today? How do you want to divide the patients? What do you want to do? And then the laissez-faire or a permissive or free reign approach is the nurse manager coming on and going, you guys figure it out, just leave me a note. There's lots of situations where all of these types of behaviors or leadership styles or behaviors would be appropriate. It's been my experience that you have to use all three of these styles, sometimes within the same event, sometimes within the same day, sometimes with the same person, which is why I think leaders that tend to be more authoritarian need to practice being democratic. If you're more laissez-faire, you probably need to find the midline or work towards finding the skills to be authoritarian. There's some things that are just black and white. You can't have an employee diverting drugs. You can't have a patient assault a staff member. Those are black and white, where the nurse manager simply goes in and says, that's it, we're not doing this. There are times that it's great to pull everybody together and have a conversation and divide the workload and have a democratic style. And then there are times that the nurse manager just needs to let the staff figure things out. There's all sorts of situations where these need to be moved interchangeably, and the skill of being able to use styles flexibly is pretty important. It's also a skill that has to be developed. I'm not going to read this slide to you. What I want you to take from this is to understand that when we think about transactional leaders versus transformational leaders, I suspect you've probably had transformational leadership talked to you quite a bit. Our transactional leaders are the traditional managers. They're the ones that manage the operations of daily tasks. When we think about transformational leaders, those tend to be our leaders and managers who are integrated. They're the person that isn't just good at managing the transaction of the day, but also inspiring and leading the team to accomplish those transactions. They're what we would call an integrated leader. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. The takeaway from this, I want you to look at this and say, okay, so one's about process and one's about process and people. The magnet recognition, which is all about nursing excellence and recognizing nursing excellence, very much focuses on does an organization allow its nurses to experience and evolve into transformational leaders? So when you think transformational leaders, connect that with magnet recognition and nursing excellence. So the next slide related to the traditional or current thinking of nursing leadership is Gardner's 1990 theory about the integrated leader and manager. So Gardner came up and said, okay, what we know is that environments, whether it's healthcare or leadership or just, production, whatever it is, works best when you have someone that can manage the logistics really, really well. And then someone who has the interpersonal skills, the leadership, the charisma, the bravery, the risk-taking to lead others through the logistics. It's an integrated leader and manager. So it's one person doing the job of both people. And this is tough stuff. It's hard to find these people, and it's also hard to really train them, because people tend to gravitate to the part of their personality that fits them best. So finding someone who can do both and do them fairly well is pretty challenging. It's also the crux of what we look at for transformational leadership. So I think this is important for you to know. Our goal, 2019, is that we're hiring, we're promoting, we're training, we're creating succession planning for leaders who are integrated leaders and managers who do it both. One of the key qualities when we think about an integrated leadership, an integrated leader, is emotional intelligence. And I'm sure this is a concept that's probably pretty familiar to you, so I will not belabor it. Emotional intelligence, for those of you that are trying to place the word, refers to the ability to use emotions effectively and is required by a leader manager in order to enhance their success. It is critical for building cooperative and effective teams, and it is the skill that is most likely to have the best results in working with teams, especially through challenges. So begin to think about the emotional intelligence iceberg. I love this picture because what we often see is the IQ of somebody. How smart are they? When we interview, we very often look at someone's GPA or their academic success, or whether they belonged to some sort of academic honor code. I love the people. I want a smart nurse, but I also really want a kind nurse. I want an emotionally well-regulated nurse. I think some of the best nurses I've ever had are those BC students who scrap really hard to get good grades, but they're just warm and they're friendly and they can problem solve really well and they deal with difficult people super graciously. Those are the emotional intelligent qualities that we want in addition to how smart you are, how competent you are. We want both. And what you see very often, just at first glance when we see somebody, is this little piece of how smart they are. You have to spend some time to figure out what their emotional intelligence is about. When you do behavioral interviewing, for those of you that are beginning the interview process, do not be surprised if most of the questions are not about how bright you are or how smart you are, but they're going to ask, how will you work with people? How will you regulate your emotions? How will you perform under stress? How nice are you? That is what they're asking about is your emotional intelligence. So be mindful of that concept. Now, we kind of talked about the logistics. Let's transition into what it means to in a nurse leader role, what it means to train versus educate. There's two components of staff development. One is training and one is education. We can train just about anybody to do something. Training may be defined as an organized method of ensuring that people have knowledge and skills for a specific purpose, and they have acquired the necessary knowledge to perform a duty. So this is about the skill necessary to do something. Education is formal. It's more formal and it's broader than the scope of training. So think about training kind of coming under the bucket of education. Whereas training has immediate use, education tends to have a broader use. When we think about competence, our goal when we're using training and education is to ensure that the person receiving the service or the education and training is competent. Competence is defined as the ability to meet the requirements for a particular role. Depending on where you're hired and where you are working as a nurse, nurse leaders sometimes have a role in training and education. Sometimes they don't. If the education department is outside your department, if it's not your formal on your organizational chart nurse leader manager, it is likely educational personnel, and they don't have authority to make you learn something or make you be competent or make you do your annual checkoffs. So they have to have a good partnership with the department nurse leadership to walk alongside people who are struggling with compliance and or learning needs. So keep in mind that if you're dealing with the education department outside of a leadership structure, they don't have formal authority. And that can make that job pretty tough. So those of you that really want to do hospital education, good luck. It is a tough job, and it is hugely important. But one of the challenges is you have a lot of responsibility and no authority over it. We're going to talk about that concept in a moment too, about being delegated something but not having the power to make it happen. Developing an educational plan, I want you to be familiar with these steps. I'm not going to read them to you because they're right there on the screen. The idea with developing an educational program is to facilitate evidence-based practice. We want you to have the best information, the most current information to apply to your practice. So when we help create an environment where evidence-based practice is expected, we know that we're going to have professional nurses in an organization that are going to provide the highest level of care. It is important that in any educational program that the nurses have access to the latest nursing research, and that we use technology to leverage that and to be able to make that accessible. A lot of our electronic medical records have integrated access to the Cochrane database or other academic resources that give you current best practice. So we do want you to go through these steps in developing an educational plan, understanding that before you come up with an education plan, you have to understand or identify the knowledge or skill needed. What's the actual need? Because you could have a great idea and no one have any interest in it not being needed at all. The next thing we're going to talk about when we think about, education and training, we think about, okay, we're going to do that with the people that are here, with all of our staff. It's a nurse leader responsibility. Another reality is, while you're trying to onboard all of these new staff and provide all this education and training, you're going to have people in varying stages of their role while they're professionally employed. Kramer, I think it was in 1974, came up with this great theory about a reality shock as a conflict between where a new graduate expects the role of nursing to be and the reality of the actual workplace. So if you are involved in training, either in a nurse residency or brand new nurses, or you as a brand new nurse, I want you to be mindful that every nurse goes through these 4 phases at some period. The first period of the honeymoon phase of you're super excited, you're thrilled you have a job, you get your first paycheck, maybe you buy your first car. Things are great because you finally arrived. You've passed NCLEX, everybody's cheering for you. About 3 months in, somebody messes with your schedule, or eats your lunch, or a patient is horribly rude, or the person that was precepting you is now not answering your questions. Something happens that shifts how you feel about being a nurse, and you begin to get frustrated. And that shock period happens to almost all, not all, but almost all new nurses. And it normally happens between the 3rd month and the 6th month, where they become overwhelmed, they become frustrated. It's also when orientation for some nurses end. There's a reason nurse residencies are for a year. Part of it is to get the new nurses through this transition. So if you get through shock, if you are mentored well and coached well through shock, and you're able to kind of align and settle into your role, then you move into recovery. And recovery is the piece of the role transition where you begin to think, okay, this isn't as bad as I thought. I'm going to figure this out. And you begin the logistics of, how do I manage the tough spots? How do I manage the things that aren't the way I thought they were going to be? And then you come into the restitution, where you get to an equilibrium of, this is my life as a nurse and I'm really okay with it. If we do not, as nurse leaders, properly intervene at the shock phase, we lose nurses. We know that between 35 and 45, depending on which study you look at, brand new nurses leave their first role, for whatever your first job is, will leave their first job within the first year. So worst studies, 45%. 20 to 25% leave nursing altogether. So a nurse leader's responsibility is really intervening during the shock phase, making sure that these new nurses have support and encouragement and direction to get through that phase, so that we can pull them back into the profession, into the recovery mode. Again, all of this is happening while you're trying to get them on board. So let's shift again and talk about team building. Part of managing that shock, managing that, first the transition into the role, but then the shock, there are varying positions that nurse leaders can play. Role modeling tends to be what I would call vicarious. It's you as an individual recognize that someone that you admire from afar, someone that you know, but maybe they're not directly in your life, has inspired you, has set an example. Our role models provide support. Their relationship can be passive or non-existent. You see, if this person's your role model, you see a behavior that you want to emulate. These are the people that inspire you, but may not have a day-to-day connection with you. We think about preceptors. Preceptors are active and purposeful. They are often assigned. When you start your job, someone will give you a preceptor. One of the first nurse leader roles that you may experience is acting as a preceptor. It is active, it's purposeful. As an experienced nurse, when you're an experienced nurse, you will be responsible for giving emotional support, providing strong clinical skill role modeling, and providing close supervision. That's the formal role of a preceptor. It's not casual like a role model would be, or maybe even not as direct as a role model. A preceptor is very direct. They're very involved. Mentors are people that you choose. So as a new nurse, you should find a mentor, someone that you say, I have a connection with this person. I enjoy their company. They're easy to be around. And I think they're a great nurse. A mentor, someone you choose, or maybe you are being chosen to mentor someone. It's an in-depth, supportive and nurturing relationship between an experienced and expert and a novice nurse. It's normally a formal relationship. It's you going to someone and saying, I really need to have somebody mentor me. Show me the roles. Have lunch with me every once in a while and just let me cry about how hard this is. That relationship normally lasts for the first couple of years of practice. Mentoring is such an important part of the role of nursing. And it's the step that I think we miss. And it's the step, because we miss, we eat our young. We forget what it was like to be a brand new nurse. We forget what it's like to be scared and overwhelmed and frustrated. So we behave poorly. My encouragement is two things. One, I want you to look for a mentor in your first part of your career. And then I want you to be a mentor after you have gotten through the first 2 years of your practice. Actively seek out people who need support and help them grow and change. So just to recap, role models are maybe passive, may not have a relationship with you at all. You're kind of admiring them from afar, using them to guide practice. Preceptors are very active. It's purposeful. It's often very clearly assigned. And mentor, someone you choose. And now let's talk about coaching. I love coaching, and I think coaching is probably one of the most important things managers do. This is someone who helps a person be their very, very best. And leaders who are in a position of influence that coach well, grow their staff exceptionally well. So this goes beyond the precepting role of the precepting of making sure that you know the logistics of what it means to be a nurse, that you're following policies and procedures. Coaching is more than teaching the logistics. Coaching is when the person is having a really tough time, pulling them in and saying, okay, let's talk about what's going well. Let's talk about things that maybe you'd like to be better at. And let's come up with a plan for how you're going to be better at that. It's such a vital role. And I do want you to kind of think about what it looks like to be a manager, to coach others, and to do it in a goal-directed way so that you're moving people forward in their profession. One of the challenges when you are working with your team, when you are, whether you're a preceptor or you're acting as a mentor or as a leader, you're coaching your team, you have to figure out what motivates people. And we have to know whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. Think about intrinsic being someone that is motivated with an internal drive to do something. And then there are people that are extrinsically motivated to do well because they're going to be rewarded externally for it. You have to be able to talk to whoever you're supporting through a precepting or a mentoring or coaching role to be able to say, what motivates you? What inspires you to do something different? What makes you do hard things? And ask them what those things look like. I tend to be intrinsically motivated. I really want to feel good about what I do. So I'm pretty self-driven. Extrinsically, I want people to be pleased with the work I do, but if you're not, I'm not overly offended by that. It matters more to me that I'm meeting my own goals and that I'm meeting what I feel like is what excellence looks like. Think about what motivates you, because that's going to matter when you look at your employment situation. How are you gonna manage keeping up your energy and staying excited about your job? And if you're intrinsically motivated, you're going to have to kind of feed your own soul and feed your own energy. And if you're extrinsically motivated, you're going to have to put some things in place to keep you energized and engaged. So let's talk a minute about communication. I want you to understand that information and communication are two different things, but you do need to have both of them to have an effective connection. Information is formal, it's impersonal. It is unaffected by information. It's a transaction of data from one person to another. Communication involves the perception of feeling. Think about communication as being the softer side of information. It is important that leaders can convey information using communication techniques that are effective. So can I tell people what they need to know in a way that it can be heard and understood and clarified if needed? Communication comes in lots of different directions, and all of these are pretty self-explanatory. You can get information from upward, downward, or horizontal. So we think about an organizational chart. People at the top talk down, people on the bottom of the organizational chart talk up. The piece of it that may be a new topic for you is grapevine communication. And that flows quickly, it's haphazard among people, and it crosses all hierarchical levels. Think of grapevine as gossip, and it is super, super hard to stop. The sender, whoever starts the grapevine communication, has little accountability for the message, and the message becomes distorted. Think about the childhood game of the telephone game, where you whisper in somebody's ear and you tell them something, and then they whisper it again to somebody else. By the time it gets around 30 people, it's not even close to the original message. The challenge with grapevine communication, it is fast, and it is really hard to stop. The most effective way to deal with grapevine communication is to deal with it in person. If there is something flying through a department and it is not, it needs to be addressed, the most effective way is to pull everyone in together and say, this is what I heard, and this is the truth, or this is the circumstance, and let me clarify. That is the most effective way to stop this form of communication. Communication channels, when we think about direction of downward or upward, I just want you to understand that it does go in these directions, and that very often downward communication is perceived as being autocratic. If downward information is coming, I'm being told something. Whereas upward communication is I'm sharing information, more of a shared governance or a democratic style. SBAR is a tool that is structured. My hope is that this is very familiar to you. I'm not going to go through the steps. It is a structured, orderly approach to providing accurate, relevant information, especially when we deal with emergent situations. So I want you to be aware of that and to be reminded of what that definition is. As a new nurse, you're going to be managing your time, and one of the roles of a nurse leader is to make sure that people are managing their time well. All of these steps are important. You want to allow time. You want to complete the highest priority task first, and then you want to try to finish one task before you begin another. I've often, you hear people say, I'm great at multitasking. And what we know now is that people aren't really multitasking. They're microtasking. So they're starting one project and then pausing it and starting another one, and then pausing it and then starting another one, and then going back to the first one and repausing it. So you begin this vicious cycle of microtasking and not really being overly efficient. So we really want to try to finish the task that you start as much as possible. Going back up to step 2, which is to complete the highest priority task whenever possible. It is important to prioritize what are the things that you must do and belong to you. I like the buckets. There are 3 buckets of don't do, do now, or do later. Don't do are the things that aren't your responsibility. If you do nothing, it'll resolve itself on its own. The do now are the large projects, the things that cannot be delegated, and things that have specific deadlines, the things that really are your responsibility. You need to handle first. And then you'll have the next list, which is the do later. These are things that are a project, but they're a long-term project. I don't have to do them today. So the first, if you've got 20 things on a list, go through and immediately rule out the things that you don't own, or if you do nothing, they're going to go away and they're going to resolve themselves. Then you deal with the do nows, the things that happen daily or are emergent, that are important. And then the do laters are the long-term projects, the bigger things that can wait a little bit. And then you reprioritize. And my encouragement is to reprioritize daily. Think strategically about how you're going to manage your time every day that you go into work. And then you want to make sure that as a nurse leader, that you're managing your time as well, because it's really easy to have your time hijacked the minute you walk into the door if you begin to handle every crisis that comes across your desk. Let's switch and talk about prioritization of care for patient care. Again, I'm not going to read this slide to you. My hope is that this is familiar and that you are comfortable with prioritizing care. The next two slides are going to be questions. And again, I'm not going to read through them and do the logistics. I do want you to be familiar with these types of questions because NCLEX is going to give them to you, as is ATI. So this is the first question. And this is the second question. So the tricky thing about these questions is that you actually have to know 4 pieces of data to be able to answer the question correctly. So practice these types of questions as you prepare for your ATI and your NCLEX. ATI, I believe you're going to see a few of those on the ATI test, but specifically NCLEX is going to ask you. So let's talk about delegation. Again, my hope is that this is a familiar concept to you, that you've talked about this in the med-surg bubble, that you are very aware of the responsibility with delegation. Again, I'm not going to read this slide to you. I want you to understand that it is your responsibility as a nurse to understand what safe delegation looks like. That understanding that delegation is a necessity, it's not an option. There's too much work for one person to do, and that delegation becomes synonymous with productivity. It is a skill that you have to learn, and it is a frequent mistake that many new managers make because they either under or over delegate, or they improperly delegate. So I want you to be thoughtful about what delegation looks like and to go back through the tasks that can be delegated and the tasks that cannot be. According to the State Nurse Practice Act, these are some guidelines for delegation. You will find every state, it has its own Nurse Practice Act. One of the things we're going to do in this course is you're going to read parts of ours in South Carolina. The Board of Nursing governs that. They determine what can be delegated within a state. So it's important to know what the state that you're practicing in, what they allow for delegation. As I said, they're common mistakes. You can under-delegate and you can over-delegate. Under-delegation can often be driven by fear that the person that is going to be doing it may not do it completely or correctly. They may want to do the job themselves. They feel like that maybe they have the better skill. They may feel like they're putting on a burden to their work colleagues, and that they'll be resented. They may lack the experience to delegate. They may not know how to go to somebody and say, I need you to do this. Interestingly, one of the most common reasons people under-delegate is because they want everything to be perfect and they like control. So be mindful. Are you someone that everything has to be a certain way? And can you let somebody else find their own way and it still be okay? Causes for over-delegation can be poor time management, spending too much time trying to get organized, as well as the insecurity about performing a specific task of your own that you delegate to someone else because you really don't want to do it. Improper delegation, again, that goes back to the 5 rights of delegation, that you violated one of those. It is important to understand that when you are delegating, that you are really following those 5 rights of delegation, and that we're not delegating tasks or things because they're not desirable. You don't delegate things because you don't want to do them. There's other reasons to delegate. And first and foremost, delegating appropriately grows and supports and offers opportunity to the person that's being delegated to. And that's important, that we share things in a good way. These are the rules of delegation. Again, these should look familiar. It's important to remember to always delegate to the right person at the right time for the right reason, and to say no when you must. There may be times when you personally, as a leader, you can't delegate for a specific appropriate reason. And there are times when someone is going to want to delegate to you that you may need to be able to say to them, this is just not something that I can do. And have some rationale for the reason that you can't do it. And you also, as part of delegation, if you've delegated something, you want to make sure that you follow up on the delegated task, and that you provide feedback and you reward people that are doing a good job. And when I say reward, it doesn't mean, giving them flowers or, a monetary gift. Sometimes it's just going up to them and saying, hey, you did a great job, and I appreciate you being part of our team. Clear communication. Again, we want to define the task that's being delegated very clearly. You want to delineate the end results and the time frame and the standards that are going to be used, and you want to delegate the objective, not the procedure. If you're going to ask an unlicensed assistive personnel, or maybe a certified nursing assistant or an LPN to make sure a patient is turned every 2 hours, you want to be able to tell them why the patient has to be turned and how they should be turned. But all the logistics of where pillows should be going and what side to do first and what side to do next, the process is not as important as giving them the responsibility to do that independently, as long as they know that what the end result needs to look like. Make sure that as part of this process that you're very clear in your communication and that you're monitoring it. Handing off or delegating a responsibility does not abdicate you of your responsibility of the delegated tasks. If you delegate a nursing assistant to turn your patient and that nursing assistant does not turn your patient, you are the one that is as culpable as that nursing assistant. You've got to monitor and make sure things are being done well. Tasks that are commonly delegated, I want you to read through that list. That should look pretty familiar. Tasks that may not be delegated, these are important as well. What are the things you really can't delegate to? I want you to read through this one. And then nursing tasks that may not routinely be delegated, but if someone has special credentials, they can be delegated to. So again, from a testing standpoint with NCLEX and ATI, if it is not expressly said that the professional has special training to provide sterile procedures, assume they do not. These are special circumstances that may be outliers. Medication administration is a huge one. You go into community group homes, we have med techs that provide medication administration, that if you pick that person up and you put them in the hospital, they would not be allowed to do it. It's only under a special circumstance that they can do that. So you want to be very aware of what someone's credentialed to do. Let's talk for a few minutes about conflict theory. When we think about conflict, when managed well, can generate new ideas. Our current 2019 thinking about how we generate new ideas, we know that good, healthy conflict can generate new ideas. It prevents stagnation. Folks, that does not mean that we go and cause conflict and stir up trouble. But what it does mean is that we tolerate the discomfort of conflict because it allows us to find new ideas. I want you to read through these bullet points and think about, how do you respond to conflict, and what do you do to navigate it? Because it's so important that we don't run from it. These are common conflict resolution strategies, and these are in your ATI book and pretty well explained. I want you to read through them and be familiar with them and understand that when we are resolving conflict, there are lots of ways to resolve a conflict. I want to talk about one of the preferred methods, and that's negotiation. It resembles a compromise. The goal in negotiating is that both parties perceive they've won something. They both have to be willing to make compromises, and they both have to be willing to agree to give up something so that they can come together on a shared agreement. The outcomes typically are whatever the very least for which person will settle is often referred to as the bottom line. Trade-offs are the things that they can negotiate on. A manager has to look carefully at the person they're negotiating with to make sure that they're all on the same table and that there aren't unspoken agendas that are afoot. So make sure that they really are negotiating from the same place. Shifting to looking at performance appraisals. So you have an employee, they've decided to stay, they're managing themselves pretty well. Eventually, you're going to have to do an evaluation. As a new nurse leader, you may be doing that managing within the department, that appraisal within the department as a support function. Especially as a new person, you may just be giving feedback. Eventually, if you're in a formal position, you're going to be responsible for a performance appraisal. All performance appraisals need to make sure that the employee should have some input into developing the standards or goals on which their performance is judged. They need to be able to have a very clear understanding of how they're going to be evaluated. And most often it's a job description that says, these are the expectations. If employees believe that the appraisal is based on the job description and what they understand their job to be, rather than whether the manager approves of them personally, they're more likely to view the appraisal as relevant. So you want buy-in, and you do that when you hire somebody. You make it very clear that this information is that their appraisal is based on how well they perform their job and the feedback that's been provided. Effective performance appraisals. This is a great list of ways to provide effective performance appraisals. The goal of any performance appraisal is professional growth. We want to provide feedback so that person can grow in their role and in their position. So that should drive everything. We want to make sure that you include positives and negatives. Data should come from multiple sources, and it should be done, the information should come from multiple examples throughout the year. You don't want to cover an evaluation over something that happened 2 weeks ago. One of the manager's ways of doing that is creating extemporaneous notes. As the year goes by, they jot down notes of things that they see the person doing really well. And then if they've ever had to provide verbal redirection or have a conversation with somebody, you make notes about that as well, so that you can explore over the year. These are the things we've talked about. These are the things that I know you've been working on. These are the things I saw you doing really well. Now let's talk about how you're going to grow next year. What are your goals? You want to always provide developmental feedback and be able to say, this is what's going well, and this is where I want to see you grow. This is an area I see for you to be stronger in. You want to avoid being indirect and ambiguous. Be very okay having conversations with not just the employees that are fabulous and there are no issues. You've got to grow them too. You've got to give them developmental feedback. Those are the easy ones. It's the employees who are struggling, and they're struggling for a variety of reasons. You've got to be willing to have those conversations, and you have to do it in an environment where they feel valued and they feel like that they're important to the team. So read through those bullet points on that slide. Sometimes you have people that just aren't doing what they need to, and you have to have some level of discipline. When we think about constructive and destructive discipline, we think about kind of the motivation. Constructive discipline helps the person address behaviors in a way that doesn't harm their hearts, that doesn't create shame and embarrassment. You address the behavior, not the person. Destructive is harmful to the person. It can result in them having anxiety, anger, frustration. They can't hear you during destructive discipline. The best kind of discipline is self-discipline. It's the people that figure out they're not doing what they need to do, and they write their course and they're able to address it. As nurse leaders, you are going to have to fine-tune how you provide constructive discipline to the individual, and make sure that there is a process in place that you're following for giving feedback and discipline. Not disciplining an employee who should be disciplined jeopardizes an organization's morale. Problems will get worse if you don't address it. Be sure that when you're addressing, if you have to do discipline, you're using a constructive method, that you provide clear written or verbal communication depending on what step, that there's a sense of mutual trust, and that it's not an authoritarian approach, that it's more of a participative type of approach of, sharing ideas and coming up with a plan for correction together, and that the person understands how whatever's going on relates to bigger organizational goals. If they've had multiple incidents of violating sterile technique and their patients keep getting infections. You want to talk to them about the implications of that behavior towards an organizational goal of not having hospital-acquired infections, so that they can see the big picture and understand that they're not being picked on, but they're being given developmental coaching, and hopefully you're doing it in a constructive way. Real briefly, let's talk about rules. You should have as few rules as necessary to make sure that departments have order and regulation. If you have a rule that's frequently being broken, you need to find out who owns the rule and do you really need the rule. Especially if a rule that keeps getting broken, there may be a problem with the rule. If the rule is important and someone is breaking it, you have to address it. If you do not address the rule, it will establish a normal and everyone else is going to follow a broken rule. So you've got to be willing to step into it and deal with the rule to avoid it from getting worse. 4 common steps in progressive discipline. You have the informal step, which is often verbal. Then you have a formal reprimand that is written, suspension, and then involuntary termination. There are lots of grids out there that give you a variety of ways of approaching discipline. Every organization has their own standard and will provide a stepwise method for if you do this specific behavior, then this happens, or if you do this, then this happens. What I want you to take from this is to understand that all discipline needs to be progressive and it needs to be in compliance with whatever your organizational policy and procedures are. That being said, there are times when there are some severe or serious infractions that you have no choice but to skip all the steps and result in involuntary termination. Diverting drugs from your employer, that'll get you fired. Harming a patient intentionally, that will get you fired. Stealing anything from your employer, likely to get you fired. You want to know what those absolutes are if you are in a leadership position, and then know that everything else follows a stepwise method. There are people that, if you think about severity, who get fired for being late, but they don't get fired the first time they're late. It is a formal, verbal, written, then a suspension, and then termination. The other piece that's important through every step of discipline is that there's mentoring for a change in their behavior. If you have someone who is consistently late and you have to reprimand them, then the verbal, okay, I'm concerned that you're late. This is a pattern. Let me show you the dates. Let's talk about why. And now let's talk about what are we going to do about this. Part of the discipline is send them to a 60-minute seminar in time management. Give them something tangible to learn a new behavior. Every step in this should have some kind of supportive training and mentoring or coaching to go along with it. If you have to get to the point of having a disciplinary conference, I want you to be thoughtful about how you're going to go about it. The primary reason to have this conference is to, again, like the rule, if you don't address it, it gets worse. I'm not going to read these steps to you, but the important thing is that you have a methodical approach to a disciplinary conference. If you have to talk to somebody because they are breaking a rule, you need to make sure that you are clearly explaining what the rule is and how it's impacting an overall organizational goal. Get information, be supportive. And before you end that conference, have a plan. Even if it is an informal verbal conversation about a behavior, before you leave that conversation, say to them, what's your plan for making sure this doesn't happen again? Agree that there's a plan, and then you move on. If you do have a verbal conversation with someone, nothing formal goes into their employment file, but my encouragement is to jot down your own notes that you keep in your own file so that you can keep track of when you've had those verbal conversations. Let's talk for a minute about communication styles. So if you're talking to someone, whether you're doing the fun stuff like precepting and mentoring and coaching, or whether you're doing the tough stuff like, enforcing policies, rules, and discipline, your style of communication matters. And I want you to be thinking about what the differences are between being assertive and being passive, being aggressive and being passive aggressive. And I love these pictures because they remind me of, the personalities that kind of go with it. I'm also a big fan of the movie Pocahontas. It was one of the early movies that I think is just so great. 101 Dalmatians was awesome too. But if you think about communication styles, I don't think any of us want to be Cruella de Vil. And I don't think many of us want to be Alice in Wonderland, who's pretty passive and not as direct. I think there's so much to be said for Pocahontas's assertiveness and strong stance and being okay with having difficult conversations, but doing it in a way that's pretty respectful. Assertiveness is our goal. We want to communicate in a way that people are able to feel that they can express their ideas. We want to be direct and honest, and we want to do it in an appropriate way that doesn't infringe on other people's rights. I think the other few I think are pretty self-explanatory. So if you're using those communication styles and you're dealing with a grievance, if you're having to discipline someone, there is always a process in place for a formal grievance. Know what that process is and follow it. I want to also add, if you are in an environment where union employees are involved, and right now, the VA system has active unions for nurses. If you're in a state where nurses are allowed to unionize, the formal grievance process is driven by the union contract. If there's not a union contract, then it is driven by the policies and procedures within your department or organization. Know what they are and make sure you're following this. Read through these steps and make sure that they make sense to you. Real briefly, I want to remind you that one of the roles of a nurse leader is financial planning. The single most important thing a nurse can do to support a department's revenue is to be sure that staff are charting accurately. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the adage that I'm sure you know is if you didn't chart it, you didn't do it. Well, the add-on to that from a financial standpoint is if you didn't chart it, you didn't do it, and therefore you don't get paid for it. Almost every click in the electronic medical record is related to some sort of diagnosis and then some sort of financial driver. So if all of these things were done, this is the level of care that was provided and this is the level that we can bill at. So when we chart accurately, we're fully capturing the care that's being provided. We're going to better support the fiscal outcome of our organization. You're going to get next to no fiscal planning information, primarily because where you'd get it would be in this course, and ATI has put next to nothing in it. I could teach for days on fiscal planning. I seriously doubt anyone actually wants to listen to all of that, but it's super important. So if you're in a position and you get promoted into a leadership position and you're part of the financial planning, get a mentor. Talk to somebody who's done it and who will guide you through it. It is not an intuitive process and it is not an easy one. So make sure, because you're probably not going to have a strong foundation in it, that you're having someone mentor you and walk alongside you as you figure that out. Most important thing is just make sure your team is documenting things appropriately. Some quick key terms. The big ones on the slide is cost containment and being cost effective. Cost containment refers to being effective and efficient in delivering care while we're generating revenue and continuing to be productive. It is everybody's responsibility, whether you're a bedside nurse leader or a formal leader, to make sure you're finding ways to be a good steward of the resources within your organization. Being cost effective means that, in economical terms, means that the product is worth the price and the cost does not always equate the quality. So cost containment and being cost effective, we want to contain our costs as healthcare providers, and we want to provide a service that is worth what we are providing. So that's the cost effective piece of this. Responsibility accounting is really dealing with how we manage the expenses and how we allot how money is spent. And forecasting is the planning for how we're going to pay our bills as a healthcare organization based on historical data. The big ones here are the cost containment and cost effective elements, and to understand that you're responsible for that. Whew. That's a lot of information. Touch base if you have questions or concerns. This is part 1. Part 2 will be shorter. I hope that this has kind of highlighted some key points for you.